Hi, everybody. Welcome to another HOSS Talks FOSS. I'm the host, Matt Yonkovit. I'm here with Emily Omier. Hi, Emily. How are you today?
I'm doing well. Thank you. Thanks for having me on the show.
No problem. So, Emily, you actually have your own consulting company that is focused on positioning open source projects, more specifically, cloud-native open source projects.
Yeah. And actually, to be fair, I generally work with what I call open source startups or cloud native startups. So companies that are looking to monetize an open source project.
Yeah. And
I think I should rephrase this. They're using open source as part of their business strategy because there's a chicken and egg sometimes. Sometimes you start with the open source project and then you want to monetize that. Sometimes you want to start a company, and then a part of that strategy is having an open source project. There are a lot of different ways that you can approach it. So open source startup or open source business. I think open source startup is usually like how I would phrase the type of company that I generally work with.
So before I get into your background, because I'm curious how you got involved in this. I am curious. You bring up an interesting point. It seems that there's a lot of businesses out there who jump onto open source because of the valuation that they see these other companies get, or like, in order to become big and a unicorn, I need to be open source. So let's do that. And it's almost more of a plugged into their business side than it is their core business. It's more like, this is how we're going to make money. This is part of our go-to-market strategy.
Yeah. I mean, I've even talked to founders that are like, if I'm going to have a company in the cloud native space, I feel like having an open source component is table stakes. Like, I just don't feel like it's feasible to have a completely closed source company. Whether or not that's true, I think is debatable because I can point to fairly successful closed source, undeniably cloud native companies. So anyway,
there are several, right?
Yes, but I do think that's also psychological. I think there are people who start from this point of I don't want to be up on a stage talking about my closed source project. Like, I feel like I'd get heckled or something like that. And that's legitimate. Not legitimate that you would get heckled. I don't think that actually happens. But
so it's legit. Yeah. Well, so it's interesting because nowadays, I think that when you talk about cloud native, a lot of people running SaaS don't have that same kind of like negative connotation around like being closed source, because it's a service, right? It's a software as a service, so you wouldn't necessarily open source that, right? And so you see a lot of SaaS products out there in the space, and they are proprietary, but there is no installation or open source component to them.
Yeah, I mean, like if it's completely SaaS, I think of SaaS as like one of the open source business models. So the SaaS, you have your open source, and then you have like the SaaS version of the open source, which in some cases is actually not. I mean, the pitch is always like, we take the open source project and we run it for you and we do everything so you don't have to do anything. The truth is that in not every situation is the SaaS product actually like identical to the open source project. They just achieve the same thing. If that makes sense. It's kind of
yeah.
It's not like in every situation, it's actually, the SaaS is actually, 95% the open source project. Sometimes it's 50, sometimes it's 20.
Yeah. No, I mean, that makes sense. So back to, how did you get into this space?
Right. Yeah. This is the fun story. I used to be a journalist, and the route that I took into the open source ecosystem was as a technology journalist and writing about technology. In fact, my first entry into technology was writing about IoT applications in like smart city applications. So that was the first stepping stone. But then I started to write about technology more broadly. Then I started to focus in on writing about cloud native. And then I also started to work for companies doing content marketing. And then from that, sort of have morphed more into doing messaging and positioning, because what I saw was that I would get hired to do some sort of content marketing and find out that, ask questions and realize that they had no idea how they were supposed to talk about the product. Basically, they had like problems that I was not going to solve with content marketing. And not only that, they were going to make my job like terrible as a content marketer. So it just like pervasive in the industry was an inability to talk about their product or their open source project, and especially how they relate to each other in a way that made sense, like to anybody. And so I really think that that's like the larger need in the industry is just being able to make sense to people.
And so is that getting back to maybe, and for those who are listening who might not understand the difference between positioning and marketing and messaging, maybe if you have an example that could help us,
Yeah, good question. So positioning is more fundamental than messaging, but they are very related. Positioning is also more fundamental than marketing. Oh, I want to say, I understand marketing is a bad word in the open source ecosystem. I think that that's actually, that's unfortunate. People shouldn't view marketing as a bad word. And in fact, if you have a pure open source project and you have no monetization goals, if this is just an open source project, you still need to do marketing, because the other way to say marketing is telling people that your thing exists. And if you don't do that, nobody will ever find out that it exists. So anyway.
If you build it, isn't a guarantee that they will come.
Exactly. So, and I would say, positioning is all about figuring out, when you're telling people that your project exists, what are you telling them? And then also, who are you telling? That's sort of the two components, is figuring out like what your product or what your project is. Right? Is this a observability platform, or is it actually a CI tool? It seems very strange, but you could conceivably have the same tool that could have some aspects related to operations and observability, and some aspects related to CI. And maybe, in that situation, actually, I'm thinking of a concrete example. In this situation, it was neither of those options were the best way to describe it, but they were both potentially accurate, because they both, the same tool had some things that were related to CI and CD, and some things that were related to operations and observability. So, you want to figure out the best market, the way that it's generally described as a market category. CI platform or CI tool is a market category. And that's like very well understood. There's a lot of things, observability is another like market category, for example. And you want to put your thing, whether it is a commercial project or or an open source project, you want to put it in the right category so that people make the right assumptions about it. I work, my business is all about like assumptions and excluding people. I just wanted to say that. Because that's what positioning is all about, actually. It's all about controlling assumptions that people make and excluding the right people. So you want people to be able to self-select in and self-select out very easily. And
so if you were developing, you mentioned observability, a tool for observability. It could have, key components that integrate into your CI/CD pipeline. Yep. But if the tool isn't designed for that, it's really designed for the overall observability. You want to make it very clear that this is first and foremost designed for that observability market. And it's really could be SREs, or it could be dev people, or it could be business people who want to know what's going on in the pipe. But it's doing the who and the what, right?
Yep. So, but here's where things get interesting. What you actually, in order to do positioning right, you have to let go of what it was designed for, because here's what can happen. You set out to design the best observability platform ever, and you integrate it with all these things, and you one of the things that you think is really important for an observability platform is that it's set up during at the deployment phase. So it has this really tight integration into your CI/CD pipeline. And as a result, it's really tightly integrated. It makes sure that all of your other observability tools are like automatically set up correctly at the deployment phase. But you think of this as like the problem you're solving is related to observability. But it could turn out that the thing that you end up creating is actually not an observability tool. And that's not how other people think about it. They may think of it as a deployment tool, because one of the features is that it sets all of your observability, all of your other observability tools up automatically. So they might think of this as actually a deployment or a delivery tool. And you had never thought of it as that. You had thought about this tool that you're setting up, you're creating, and it's for SREs. And then you take a step back, you talk to the people who are actually using it, and it turns out none of them are SREs. Or maybe it turns out 30% are SREs and 70% are somebody else. And it turns out that when they talk about your tool, they're not even using the word observability or whatever it is. So that's the challenge, is that it's not about how you designed or what you designed your product or your project to be, but actually about what it ends up achieving in the real world and how other people perceive it. That's the other key, is that it's also about how other people perceive it.
And I would imagine that's a very difficult for a lot of companies and a lot of projects, because a lot of open source founders and contributors are very passionate about a certain space. And to learn that if they're passionate about A, but their product isn't being used for A, that it's really being used for B, and they're like, "Ooh, I don't even care about B." I would imagine that creates a bit of frustration.
It can be really challenging for companies. I was talking with somebody, and they have a open source project and a related product that is related to container management. I'll use fairly broad terms, so we can't pin down who this is. But they were getting a lot of interest from companies that have edge devices. And they never intended this to be a tool that had anything to do with edge. It was not designed with the intention that this would be for deployments of 100,000 edge devices. But they have a bunch of people who are interested in that. And they're really hesitant. Do I think that that's where they should go? Yes. I think it's actually almost obvious, almost like staring them in the face, that they need to focus on this enterprise edge deployment use case of both the open source and the paid product. But that's hard, because it's a pivot, and it, particularly when you're talking about a company, it involves buy-in from the board and the investors and buy-in from the whole team. It's easier if you're just a scrappy open source project, you can make that pivot. Logistically it's easier, but psychologically it's not necessarily easier, because you're I didn't mean for this to be used in this way. What's going on? It's hard.
So a lot of this, when you're talking about positioning, where you're helping companies do is uncover what their users perceive their product or the project to be good at, where it fits in, and where they might be able to start to accelerate their business a bit by focusing more on the things that are already naturally occurring.
Yep, exactly. The way I think about it is like, how do you uncover what your thing? Because really, a lot of the things I'm talking about, they apply equally to projects and products. But I will talk about some specifics related to open source later. But what does your thing already naturally do better than any other option? And sometimes it's not the thing you originally thought of.
But I think that's where, and I've talked to a lot of founders of companies, and it's interesting because you see they have a very clear vision, and sometimes that vision doesn't match the reality.
Yes.
Right? And I think that's where there's always a challenge, right? Because I'm going to go build the best X, and you turned out building the best Y.
Yep.
That's not a bad thing.
So
it's just a different.
Here's what I have to say about this. This actually all comes down to goals. So I was talking with Guy, the founder of Sneak, a while ago, and he was talking about how there was a moment at Sneak where they wondered, did we actually build Y instead of X? And it looked like it would be better potentially for their business to pivot a little bit, and they did not. And there were two reasons for that. Reason number one was that they had a vision that was related to almost like a mission about incorporating security into development. And two, they were already financially secure. So from a financial perspective, it's not going to say it didn't matter, but it was not going to be like he'd already had a successful startup, and he basically, the way that he said it was like, my priority was achieving this mission, not having a successful business. The mission was more important than the successful business. If that's the case, then it makes sense to keep pushing on your business or on your mission. Sorry. It makes sense, if it's really mission driven. And I can definitely see that, like when we're talking about something like security, I think that can make sense. If, on the other hand, what's really important to you is that this business is successful, you don't want to ignore signs like that. Same, if and when I say ignore, like they did not ignore the signs. They looked at the signs, said, we understand what this could potentially mean, and we've decided that we are not going to act on it, which is actually different from ignoring it. Ignoring is never a good idea.
But I mean, it gives you the opportunity to make changes to your own products or, setup to maybe reinforce what your vision or your mission is.
Yep.
But I think that this gets back to another blog you wrote on why an amazing open source project doesn't always equal an amazing company, right? And I think that, this is where your vision might not necessarily translate into dollars in some cases.
Yeah. And, sometimes it doesn't. The thing that I always like to say to founders is you have to understand that a lot of times an open source user they're just not the same profile as a commercial purchaser. And that's okay. I mean, it's just how it is. It's okay. It's how open source works. I don't think an open source project should ever be like your lead funnel for your commercial product. Do I think an open source project could be like, marketing or something? Sure, maybe, but it's about having awareness that your company exists. I think viewing an open source project as a lead funnel is not effective, and I think it alienates the open source community. And I also, it just doesn't work because the fundamental characteristics of the open source users generally don't have a huge overlap with a commercial purchaser.
So what kind of process or what kind of things, if you're looking to figure out your positioning or validate what you think it already is, what sort of things should you look at? Where should you kind of poke around?
Yeah. So the first step is always figuring out who loves you the most. So if you have an open source project, I'm going to go ahead and talk about open source projects here, but if you have an open source project, so first you want to figure out what success looks like to you if you have an open source project, just because success can have different meanings in an open source context. Like why do you have this open source project in the first place? Like, for example, Facebook uses open source projects for recruiting.
Right.
If that's why you use an open source project, why you have your open source project, you have certain goals in mind. And you have to be aware of that. That's different goals than if you are just, some person who's doing this for fun. Or if you are a company that's hoping to, build a business that's related to open source in some way. So figure out what success looks like and why you're doing this in the first place. And then you want to identify who are the people you wish you had more of. So if you want, more code contributors, look at your code contributors and think, who are the contributors who are really awesome and who I wish I could clone, and talk to some of them. But you want to, and this goes the same. So if you have a paid product, figure out who the customers who are really awesome are, the customers who are like super excited, and the customers who just like do not care about all of your weaknesses. You have some weaknesses, whether it's your open source or paid. Like there are some things about your product that suck. Some people don't care, and you want to like focus on those people. And so talk to them. You want to figure out like, how do they use your project or your product? Why do they use your product or your project? What was the moment when they decided that they were going to try this out? What pain were they experiencing, and what did they want to achieve? And what words do they use to describe your product? I always ask a question when I do customer interviews, like if you were to describe this to a colleague, what would you say? And that's, you don't want to rely 100% on that, but it's a really good input into how people, the type of people that you want more of, how they think about your thing. So then after you do that, you sort of use that as like a jumping off point to then think about, oh, there's something I missed that's really important. What would they do if you didn't exist? And that's really important, actually, because it tells you what the true comparison that they're making in their head is. So the thing that a lot of founders also sort of get really hung up on is their competitors. And when they say competitors, they mean like, some other startup that does the same thing that they do. But in the minds of a lot of users, the competitor is to do nothing. It's the status quo. And
that's a big thing. Yeah.
Yes. And the status quo could mean like to achieve the same outcome, we're going to hire a new person, or to achieve the same outcome, we're going to do manual work for 8 hours, or to achieve the same outcome, for security, I always say like for security, like to achieve the same outcome, we're going to cross our fingers. And, what would they actually do if you didn't exist? That's who they're really comparing you to. So if you say you're really easy to use and the alternative is crossing your fingers, people are going to be like, I'll just keep crossing my fingers.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting. You brought up a couple of really interesting points. I think that one of the things that most people don't realize is apathy or doing nothing is the biggest threat to open source companies, right?
Yes. Because all companies.
Well,
this is not unique about open source companies.
But there's a uniqueness in the open source side, because when you talk about paying customers versus users, you can be a user and not a paying customer. In fact, most companies have way more users than paying customers. We did some surveys the last few years, and they asked, how willing are you to pay for enterprise features? 2/3 are already predisposed to never pay for anything in open source, right? And that's probably a low number. So, you have this group of people who their thought process is, I don't want to necessarily pay right out of the box. And so when you say, oh, are they choosing your product? Are they choosing to buy the enterprise version or pay for your software as a service or your platform as a service? And they're just saying no. That's just a natural thing. And they can choose to just self-support, choose to self-run, or choose to not use your product at all.
Yeah, so the thing that's really unique about positioning for open source companies is that you do have to position against yourself, against your, you have to position your paid offering, and you have to position your open source project. And ideally, right, you want them both to be successful.
Oh, yeah.
So, right, you want them both to be attracting people that are in the right place. And this comes down to the who question, right? And why I say like I deal in exclusion and assumptions, because you want it to be really easy for people to self-exclude, so to speak, or self-select is really the right word. And this goes for people who are not appropriate for either of your offerings, your open source or your paid thing. But you also want people to really easily understand which of those two things is best for them. And, the way that I think about it, this is really hard for companies. But you don't want people who would actually be better off in open source to be paying you just as much as you don't want people who would actually be better off with the paid thing to be just self-supporting with open source.
That is a hard pitch to a lot of shareholders and investors. It really is. I'm not saying I agree with you 100%, by the way. That's a hard thing to say, though. The hardest thing with any startup or any business is figuring out when to say no, right? And I think that is potentially one of the biggest mistakes startups make is they try to overcorrect and capture too much of the market, chase too many of the dollars. There's a lot of business books out there that talk about, to be this successful unicorn or the top company in your space, you need 7% of that market. That's it. And that's a very tiny amount.
I didn't hear that figure. That's not much.
Well, yeah. So it comes from, a series of books on the Rockefeller methods. Vern, his first name's Vern. His last name starts with an H, but I will remember it after this probably. Anyways, he talked quite a bit about like IKEA. IKEA is a well-known brand, right? And they own less than 7% of the entire furniture market, but they are considered this, massive brand. But they focus just on people who want to build their own furniture and don't want the hassle of, all this other stuff so cheap. So they've kind of got their positioning down, and they're focused, and they're willing to, this is our box, and we're going to dominate that box.
The IKEA customer is kind of like the open source customer. They're willing to put in some elbow grease on their own.
Right.
Like the open source user. But the point of positioning actually is to take that broader market and narrow it down so that instead it's like you might say, well, we have 7% of the overall furniture market, but we have, let's say, 90% of the market, and I'm just making that up, of the market for, people who have a tight budget and they don't like to shop at thrift shops, right? Because I would imagine like one of the competitive alternatives for IKEA is going to Goodwill, and right, it's going to be similar. It's going to be a similar price point probably, and like honestly, you'll probably get higher quality at Goodwill. So IKEA's positioning is people who have some people hate buying used furniture or used stuff in general. So therefore, good-looking furniture for people who are averse to buying used and don't really care about quality.
I mean,
right?
But that's positioning, right?
Exactly and their positioning.
Right. And you've narrowed that down now to a point where you can focus on, when you talk about marketing activities, That's where do those people exist? That's where you want to focus. When you talk about new products, what does that subset want in their products?
Exactly.
And it's very hard.
And now IKEA has like 100% of that market. I mean, where else do you go if you have a super tight budget, but you're not going to go shop at Goodwill?
Right. I mean, you're right.
I mean, that's a low part of the market. But if you just don't like to use stuff in general, you don't shop at garage sales either. I like garage sales. So.
That's okay, right? I mean, it's fun. But I think that's where, and as I talk with different executives, and they look at the broader market, and they're like, "Ooh, we're going to capture all this market. We're going to this is what we're going to do." And you see open source projects start as a core set of mission values, and then over time, to expand their market share, they start to try to add new features, new functionality, new other things to jump, right? Hey, we're really focused on this. Let's jump to the next size and the next. And they often lose their purpose in a lot of cases. It's hard for them to narrow back down because it's, again, saying no.
Yeah. So, and the problem, of course, with that is that if you're trying to expand by adding new features, you can, in fact, end up serving your original target market or serving a core market worse than you did at the beginning. And, I wouldn't say, I will caution the companies, I say you totally should expand, but certainly it's like you want to be proportionate. If you're Google, like do whatever you want, take on whatever market you want.
Yeah, if you've got that much money, there's a different rule book.
Exactly. But at the beginning, when you have $5 million of venture funding, for example, or, even more so if you're bootstrapped, so you have like your severance pay from your last job, and you're trying to figure out how to focus. Well, you have to really focus in on a very tight market because it's just otherwise you won't get any traction. And you also can't legitimately claim to serve the needs of a super diverse group of customers. But it is totally possible with very limited resources to meet the needs of a very, very specific type of customer or open source user, right? This applies equally, I want to say, to open source projects. So if you are just one person who's developing an open source project in their spare time, and you want an open source project that's going to actually get used and that's going to develop a community and that's going to have like a vibrant community that's not just you want to focus on something really specific where that the existing options are not serving that market well. And that there's lots and lots of opportunities because again, the big guys, the like Googles and AWSs and Red Hats, they are just too big to go after really, really tiny subsets. And they're going to offer like these sort of all general purpose, all in one solutions that are not going to meet the needs of really specific niches. And if you as a startup can, then, one of the questions a lot of companies or a lot of like very early stage companies get is like, why would I go with you? Or you're going to go out of business in 2 years, or, it seems like a risk, whatever, blah, blah, blah. But if you can say like, yes, we might go out of business in 2 years, that is true. But we offer, X, Y, Z. And when you say X, Y, Z, you should be talking about value or at least benefits, not like the features. But we let you do X, Y, Z that's really important to people who fit your very specific characteristic. And if you go to AWS, sure, you can use a general purpose thing and you can spend the next 2 months like clicking boxes to set it up. But we have this thing and it perfectly meets exactly the needs that you have. Then, yeah, like they're going to say yes, they're going to go for that. And they're going to tell their friends that are like fit their exact same characteristics. And guess what? If there's only 100 of those people that exist in the world, you can probably, they probably already know each other. B, you can meet your sales goal. I mean, if your sales goal is like 8 for this next year, or even if your sales goal is like 20 for the next year, you're actually more likely to meet it if you're in this like really, really narrow niche and you fix something and are able to communicate that you fix that thing really, really well than if you're trying to sell 20 general purpose, blah, sort of mushy things to anyone who comes.
And I think that's where, if you can narrow your focus, especially early on, and you build that fervent fan base within that segment, it becomes easier to have those conversations with those people on what else can we do to help you?
Yes.
And that's how you can expand.
Yep, exactly. And, you can also expand. You can expand to adjacent markets. You can expand, to adjacent. There's a lot of ways, by the way, that I define like characteristics. This is another thing I think people get really caught up on is they get caught up on like industry verticals, and particularly in the open source space and in this space that I work in. I actually like to focus on like characteristics of the application or of the cloud workload or whatever. So is it bound by any compliance frameworks? Is it like, how sensitive is it, right? We've talked about security, but everyone talks about how they want everything to be maximally secure, and that's not true. But you do have some things that are more sensitive than others. So that's a characteristic of an application. It could be it's written in a particular language. It could be it uses uses particular other tools, or it has particular other dependencies. So you want to think about characteristics of the application. Those are really, I think, even more important than thinking about characteristics of the company.
Yeah, and I think that's a trap we all fall into, is especially when you're talking about infrastructure software, right? When you're talking about end user functionality and you've got an app that does, finance stuff, the finance industry is a targeted audience, yes.
Right.
But when you're talking about a database, or you're talking about Kubernetes, or you're talking about, different infrastructure components, it's often they're running the same thing. They might use different features.
Yes.
But you'll probably have lumps of core value that certain people will get, yep. Right? And, in the case of Kubernetes, it could be they want to eliminate human error, right? So they want to have repeated, like the same all the time, right? And that, making sure that they can reduce, human error and improve efficiencies, the big thing. And that could be a thing that is very valuable to retail and to healthcare and to banking, all in the same bucket.
Yep, definitely. I mean, and you do think that, so within an organization, there's going to be different buckets, right? And particularly if you're talking about like a big organization. So let's say, we're talking about a huge retail enterprise. They are going to have some apps that are customer facing, and they're going to have some that are not. They're going to have some that deal with personal information. They're going to have some that do not. They're going to have some that if they go down, it costs them like, $1 million a second. They're going to have some that can go down for 2 weeks, and it's kind of annoying, but it's not really a big deal. And so that's why I think it's important to really, really dial in on the characteristics of the application rather than like focusing too much on the company, because, a customer facing application at an e-commerce site versus at a bank, well, maybe banking is bad because that's like really high stakes. But, a customer facing application that produces revenue in some way is going to be like vastly more important, regardless of what industry it's in, than an internal like HR application. Or
a blog or a wiki or a
or something that's customer facing but that doesn't produce revenue, right? So you want to think of that, like that's actually a really good characteristic to think of. Like, is this related to something that produces revenue or not?
Okay, great. So Emily, where can people find out more about what you do and maybe take a look at, some of the articles, and you even have your own podcast, which I was a guest on?
Yes. Thank you so much.
Where can they find this?
So you can come to my website, which is emilyomier.com. I know my last name's a little hard to spell, but you can also look for Cloud Native Startup, which is my podcast. Positioning Open Source is my blog. If you just go to positioningopensource.com, that will lead you over to my website and to my blog. Let's see, what else? I also write a column at the New Stack that is about entrepreneurship for engineers. So you can head over to the New Stack and find some of my work there. I think that's about it.
All right.
I'm all open, so.
Yeah, well, like everybody nowadays, right? So many ways to get in touch with people. Yeah. But Emily, thank you for coming. And I would encourage everybody to check out Emily's blogs and her podcast, especially if you're in that startup space, you're looking to maybe start a new company, you're looking for some advice and looking to how to accelerate maybe your open source project as well.
Thank you so much.
All right. Thanks, Emily. Thanks for coming in.
Wow, what a great episode that was. We really appreciate you coming and checking it out. We hope that you love open source as much as we do. If you like this video, go ahead and subscribe to us on the YouTube channel. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And of course, tune in to next week's episode. We really appreciate you coming and talking open source with us.